it over to Robin.
Okay, thank you very much, Molly. I hope everyone can hear me. And I'm very grateful to have you all joining us today to hear this presentation. So my hope is that I'm going to give you some strength and some courage when you're talking to the inspectors and assessors and be able to basically show them what you have had done and what you've done to augment any validation you outsource to VC Solutions perhaps. And that's where we're going to get into some meat of using documentation that basically you already have. So here's our agenda, and we should take up about hopefully 50 minutes of the hour, so I can give you back a couple of minutes to get back to work from your perhaps lunch. But we're going to go over the history of governance. It's a very short timeline because it's only been the last 25 years or so that we've had any guidance. We're going to talk about the software life cycle for the QA activities for what the end user is responsible for. We're not going to go into the vendor. We're just going to stick with what you're responsible for. We're going to talk a little bit about the meaning of change and change management, which I consider really crucial and critical to a successful project. We'll go over all the user validation that's required for you to maintain your compliance, and then the process of using documentation that you've been provided or you've made yourself, put together yourself to be able to defend or show what you've done. And questions and answers, again, as Molly said earlier, we're going to have you email those to me, and we'll send them all the questions and answers out after the presentation. So as far as the history of governance goes, you can see on this timeline it all started around 1991, 1989, 1990, 1991. That's all kind of merged together in my brain. But the FDA issued the memorandum to all the registered blood establishments and said that validation was a medical device. And then, I'm sorry, that blood bank software was a medical device. And then, lo and behold, this word validation became a buzzword amongst all our peers. Because they were being asked, or you were being asked, and I was being asked to provide validation. How did I validate the system? And no one knew what the word meant. So it moved kind of at its own pace, but for us, kind of quickly. 1992, it was the software validation was actually best practice. So it took us about a year of, what does this mean, to, okay, we know what it means now. How do we get it done? And then in 2003, and as Molly said, I joined the ISBT Validation Task Force as a co-chair. And in 2003, we put out the first version of guidelines we felt would give you information enough to be able to say, show that you're in control. Of course, just like anything, in 2010, we put out version 2, and we're working on a new version. As a matter of fact, I was on a meeting this morning and hoping to have a new version by 2018, which is going to stress installation qualification, especially in the world of clouds and servers that aren't in our blood bank. So I like to start with the software life cycle just to make sure that we're all on the same page. And of course, I'm talking about quality assurance activities on this software life cycle, and I'm sure there are other activities that are being done in the lab or in the facility, but these are the things that we're blood bankers we're basically responsible to have documented, and so I'm going to use this as our life cycle for the quality assurance. And I love how this depicts the actual cycle of how this happens. And there are a few kind of important points that we'll go over. The one that I want to bring out the most, if you can see my pointer, you see that I'm circling the freeze database, because that's something that's needed in order to be able to prove that you validated the system as it will become production, or as it will be put into production. So the freezing of the database is very important because of that. But there's a few things I want to particularly stress, and the first is that you'll notice that the user requirement specifications are where this begins. So for us in blood banking world, thinking about what are user requirements, to us those are the requirements that the AABB and FDA put out for blood banking for you, and they basically can be applied to the computer system. If the computer system is your system of record, then therefore it becomes critical that your user requirement specifications are going to be what you need to do in order to meet these regulations from the accrediting agencies. So I think it's real important that we see that it all begins with the requirements, and requirements in our world could mean the RFP that we put together when we selected the vendor to put in this new system. What did we tell them they have to adhere to? Or it could be the notes that you get from your vendor when you're doing an upgrade, making sure that the system upgraded still meets those requirements. I'm sorry. And the second thing that I want to make sure you realize is that this cycle, if you use it, shows you kind of the order that things get done in. Now, sometimes we try and do a few things in the same activity, but we're still taking those user requirements, looking at the risk, because the FDA says that we should do a risk-based validation. So looking at the risk that's in the system, using that perhaps to qualify your vendor or put your RFP together. That's one way of using those requirements. Perform good testing on the system before you get to the freeze. And then again, what I'm trying to show you is that once the freeze happens, you're under change control, strict change control, and your validation has to be of the system that will become production. So it could be the system you validated, version 1 or version 1.1, and then you get version 1.2, and now the requirements are how does the new version meet the things that I have to do in order to do good blood banking according to the AABB and the FDA. Then you freeze your database once you have your good testing done, and that's where your validation begins. And this is validation activities, and then some other processes that you should have documented. Specifically, I want to speak to the change control, because change management is absolutely critical. Once your system has been frozen and you say, this is my production system, or will be my production system, or will be copied in and become my production system, then everything you do after that, you must have a good change control procedure. Again, this is where I said that I would cover the meaning of change and change management. So what do we mean by change? So a change is any modification, alteration, or revision to a validated automated process or automated system, no matter how small or inconsequential the revision is. So what I'm saying by saying no matter how small is that every change needs to be evaluated. I'm not saying that when you put together this change management program that you need to, everything you put down there you have to validate. What I'm saying is you have to consider every change, no matter how small that change is, and make sure that it's accounted for if needed. If it's risky and it has a level of risk that you've determined you can't tolerate, and you have to make sure something's happening about that, then you have to do validation or to make sure that, and to prove that that has been taken into account. But some things are small, may not need validation, but what I'm trying to emphasize here is that they still need to be considered, because sometimes those changes, you know, even small, and when they add up, it could be something bigger, and everyone needs to account for that. And so what do I mean by considered? What I mean by considered is as part of your change control program, you need to think about everything that's changing and then determine what's risky and what needs to be validated. So what is change control? It's the formal system by which representatives from all different places in your facility perhaps that might be affected by the change that you're making come together. They discuss whatever the proposed change is, whatever, you know, those changes will be, you know, or how they affect your validated status, or how they'll affect nursing, or how they'll affect ordering. So no matter how small, again, I'm saying there needs to be a formal system by which people who are going to be affected by the change come together and discuss the change. And our intent is to determine the need for action that would ensure and document that the system is maintained in a validated state. And what I mean by that is that our goal is to mitigate the risk, and we're going for patient safety. So these are all things that you put together in your change control policy and your change control documentation, because we're trying to prove that if there's risk in this change, that we're going to consider all of the QA activities needed. You can go back to that life cycle and look at all those QA activities needed to maintain control while making this change. And the change can be a new system, or it could be an upgrade to an already validated system. So what do I mean by, because I've been saying the word risk already a few times, and what do I mean by risk, and what do I do about it if I find there's risk in the system, or what do you guys have to do about it if we find there's risk? Well, there's several definitions of risk. One is that it's something where there's the possibility of loss or injury. This one fits us pretty well, that the system, if it does not make the right decision, could it injure a patient and cause, or actually perhaps, God forbid, cause a death to a patient in the facility because the system did not make the right decision. If it's got critical control points, this adds to the possibility that the system could cause harm to a patient or a donor or a business. So looking at critical control points will show you the risk that's in the system. And then another term that you might have heard in place of risk, because it seems like we use these terms interchangeably, is a hazard. And that's a condition that may lead to an unintended event that causes an undesirable outcome or injury or death to a patient. So this is why the FDA, if we could look at, stay on this slide for a second, but this is why the FDA was worried in 1991 and sent out a letter and said blood bank systems are a medical device. And I'm sure, you know, I'm speaking to a lot of blood bankers in the audience, and we all understand in blood banking that we're the place in the lab that if we make a mistake and there isn't a way for the system to catch that mistake, then we could actually cause severe harm to a patient, and that's a hazard. Okay, so of course it's not enough to just identify the risk. That would be too easy. If we said, okay, that's risky, yeah, we know it's risky, but unfortunately, when we decide there's risk, we have to do something about it. So the first thing we have to do is say there's risk, okay, and we have to identify what level of risk does this thing have. And of course, high is something that could really kill a patient. Moderate is something that could harm a patient, but it would not end in death. And low is something that's kind of an inconvenience, and you'd like it to work because the user interface is much better if it does, but it really wouldn't kill anyone or hurt anyone if it didn't. Okay, so the first thing is just identify that there's risk. And then the second thing is to develop a logical approach to estimate the likelihood and probability and consequences if something did happen. I'm going to tell you that this is great for general risk in the system or lab system or in the laboratory as a whole to look at probability, but when we're talking about high risk things that could severely injure or kill a patient, and we're going to validate to that risk, we don't really care about the likelihood, because what we know is one time is bad enough. So to us, likelihood is not important for OQ validation for when we're really challenging the system. We're just going to look at, is there risk? But for general projects as a whole, because there's a lot of usefulness for doing risk analysis and having a risk management plan. Just in general, evaluating the likelihood or probability could probably help you to identify which things you need to stress most. And then, of course, once you've done this risk assessment, and if you're going to do likelihood and probability, you factor that in, then you have to have a risk mitigation plan. Okay, so those are the pieces of a risk management. And so you begin with the risk assessment, and so again, I talked about that it's got to have some real severe consequence if it doesn't work. And it's the tool to, by the way, that you will use, and we'll talk about it when I show you the process that you can use to defend or show your validation. This tool will be what you'll reference to say, here's how I decided with the help of a third party maybe, or on my own, and BC Solutions for a lot of you. We determined that this is how we will restrict our validation for OQ to the things that fall into high or high moderate, or however you determine you would do it. And this is a great tool, so keep that in mind and keep it in your pocketbook or your pockets, not literally, but just visually, that that's going to be something that you're going to have to keep going to, or it's going to be in your best interest to keep going back to that risk assessment. And of course, BC Solutions does a risk assessment of the requirements for you if you're using us, or you hope to use us in the future, which I hope. So the other thing in this risk management plan is, again, it's not enough to just assess the risk, and it's not enough to say, is it going to happen or isn't it going to happen? You have to decide how this risk will be mitigated. So you need strategies to control, eliminate, or reduce or mitigate the risk. And all of this, telling you about it because it all needs to be documented somewhere. So this should all be documented, your strategies that you'll use to eliminate any risk. You select and implement your strategy depending on the issue and what happened and how it needs to be fixed. You need to make sure that whatever you put in place is effective, and that you validate whatever you put in place if it's, we'll talk about some mitigation in a second, but depending on what you're doing, you'll have to either put something in writing, or you might have some strategy that involves your computer system. And you have to make sure, this is a big one, folks, you have to make sure when you put a plan in place to mitigate one risk that you don't create another risk, even bigger than the risk that you were mitigating when you put your plan into use. So think about that. You never want to create new risks with your plan to solve a problem. So here are the really 3 techniques we use. You could do a manual workaround with an SOP, so make sure your user doesn't get to the risky functionality. That's probably the least effective kind of mitigation, but oftentimes it's the best we can do. You can have your vendor change the system, give you a new program, give you a new version of the system where this has been fixed, or you can change your configuration so that it works the way you need it to keep you out of risk. So depending on the issue you come up with, or the requirement that can't be filled by the computer system, you have to decide what you're going to do as far as how you're going to mitigate the risks. So I've been talking a lot about change management and risk because these become the crux of all of the documentation or planning or plans that you need to put together. And don't panic. I can show you something that you can use to do that. But really you need to have to show that you're in control, and you need to take these steps in some way or another. You need to have some kind of management of your project to take this software either as a new system or as an upgrade. You have to have a quality management system and a quality policy. So there has to be some quality tenets that your either your lab or your blood bank or your hospital or your corporation have in place that says something like, we believe in quality, ... and probably ends with, and we will do everything we can to make sure there's as little risk as possible in our system. And that's what we're trying to show, is that you're doing that. You have to, of course, document that change management and the risk management plan. Have a training plan, have a testing plan. So what will you do before the freeze? What kind of testing? What kind of validation will you do after the freeze that will be also testing, but in the frozen system using validation techniques? And the best thing I can show you is that you have a master plan, a validation master plan put together. It's the best planning document I've seen out there, a validation master plan or a master validation plan, because what it does is it gives you a historical record of all of the parts of the automated system and the validation activities and the responsibilities and the procedures and et cetera. And it includes managing your changes to make sure that you're in control and that you can prove you're in control. And it has these useful elements in it that, again, having all of this in one place, and you'll see when we go over how to use everything, having everything in one place put together is very important. And showing an organizational commitment, that goes back to having a quality system in place and having a commitment from your organization that they believe in quality and that they've documented that in a policy is really the best way to begin, is having that commitment. Everything being documented, having a plan, those plans that I outlined previously, having that all documented and putting it in one place is a great thing. Showing that you have knowledge of the system and the process that you're doing, and that, again, shows that you're in control. You know, show that your personnel have been trained. And of course, I think you've probably heard me say before, if you've heard me speak, that people are our most fickle part of the system. The computer system will work the same time every way, but sometimes people are a little more creative than the computer system. So it's very important that you have everyone trained. You have standard operating procedures for everything, and I'm probably going to keep stressing that. That you've got a plan for all the testing and validation needed. You know who needs to review and approve and authorize your plan, so that's all in here. There's a post-implementation review. There's a change management and monitoring plan, and you make sure that you know that your records are safe, and how long you're supposed to keep those records are very important. So I just want to, I'm going to go kind of quickly on the next couple of slides. I've shown these before, and by the way, you'll find this presentation on the website after we've finished it, so you can get look at all this information. But you know, I want to just make sure that we all know that validation begins again at the beginning. That's all validation activities. It's not all testing activities, validation testing, but all those activities even before the freeze are all part of how you're validating that your system is in a state of control. So I just want to stress that it starts at the beginning. Just think validation from the very beginning. You know, system has to be configured and frozen, and change control is used. Once the system has been frozen, very important. I know in years that I was doing testing of systems, it's very easy to forget what you've tested, what you've entered, where you are in your plan if you don't document. So, you know, it's very easy to lose your place and actually probably do more work than you need to because you don't know where you are. And so that documenting as you go is very important. So also going back to this plan, this validation plan, helps you to know what kind of testing needs to be done. Are there control functions? Yes, then validation is needed. And if you document all of this, what will be needed if it shows a certain risk, etc., you'll be a step ahead for when your inspectors or assessors come in to take a look at and see what you did. So of course, IQCQ, PQ, I've talked about that a lot. Again, I just want to make sure everyone's on the same page, that this is how we define validation currently in our industry. We don't always use the terminology IQ, OQ, PQ, but if you break it up into these components, I find, and I think our clients find, that it's easier to keep track of what you need to do and how you need to document it if you break it up into what's the activity and what's the goal of it. So quickly, IQ, installation qualification. This is like a baseline validating the servers, that they talk to each other, the interface, you know, you can knack it and you get a ACK back or whatever, ACK and knack, and that's basically working. This is before you add processing through your blood bank system, but just the basic processing. Depending on what it is, there's different qualification that needs to be done. And just to wet your whistle for the new version of the validation guidelines, this is the area we are planning to stress the most in the guidelines, because we realized this was not really flushed out in version 1 or 2, because we stressed the other validation activities. But look for this to be flushed out to help you know how to validate that your basic hardware, software is installed correctly and works as expected. How it should be documented is, again, depends on what it is. Is it a printer? Is it a scanner? Is it a network? But you need some evidence that all the hardware and software were installed correctly and according to the manufacturer's directions. And that's what we're trying to get at here, is that we want to make sure everything's installed right, because if you go on to validate your your blood bank system or your BECS, and it doesn't work, then you don't know, was the printer ever turned on? Was it ever cabled to the right place? Is it on the network? All those things. So you're going to have a harder time trying to distinguish what the problem is if you haven't qualified everything ahead of time. So that's our goal. And all of the findings from the IQ needs to be documented. And again, I want to stress in having it documented all in one place is very helpful when you're sitting down with the assessor or inspector. So the next validation activity, OQ, okay, this is what many of you have contracted with us to do for validation. This is where we do the risk-based validation. We're stressing how you have your system set up and making sure that your system still meets the requirements that you have for blood banking by the FDA, if there are any, and AABB predominantly. So that's the goal of the OQ validation. We're trying to prove that any risk that's in the system is handled appropriately, and even in the worst case scenario, it's going to work to make a good product or to do a good cross-match and send out a unit that is good for that patient, and everything's going to go well. So that's what we're trying to prove ahead of time. Okay, and how it should be documented, well, of course, user requirements, which I've talked about, assessing the risk of those, test scripts, and here's where we're writing very, very detailed test scripts that says what to input, what your expected response should be, has a place for you to document the file that your evidence is in to prove that you got that expected response, a pass-fail column so that you can say yes or no, this was okay, this worked the way I expected, and ideally a cross-reference to the requirements. When you have that, then the inspector knows exactly where these things were validated. You always want to have files that capture the evidence or printouts that show that are used as evidence that the system did perform as expected. Anything that it doesn't, you want to make sure you have a problem form or a deviation form, or there's all sorts of ways to express what that is. But basically you're trying to find all the places you don't get the expected response, or even if you get the expected response but it's not mitigating your risk, you might want a problem form for that. Also documents summarizing your process and findings, and again, ideally, a matrix document that cross-references those requirements to the scripts. And all of this evidence and documentation needs to be kept and needs to be able to, in some way, be shown to the inspector. I think it's really important that you have a validation report that you've written with your summary, of what you were doing, what the activity was about, what you were trying to prove, what you found, and that's oftentimes turned into an executive summary, which is going to be very useful later on when you're showing the inspector or the assessor what you've got, and you're again, not trying to defend it as much, although that's the title of this presentation, but ideally you want to be in a place where you can just show them proudly what you've done, and an executive summary is a good place to begin for them to look over what your plan was. And again, we talked all about all those plans. Those are the things you want to show them, or at least short, in the executive summary, a short informational paragraph on what all those plans were for and why you did them and what your findings were. You want all your test plans, the capture of all of your evidence, which is the actual results proving that the system behaved as expected, or if not, some proof that you took that as a problem. If it had risk, that you went into your risk mitigation plan. Matrix analysis, again, this is what we do. We find it so valuable, and we know our clients do as well, because it cross-references and easily shows the person who's sitting there saying to you, did you do validation? It easily shows them that you did a risk strategy, and the highest risk was validated more, because the matrix for the high-risk items will have several, usually, scripts and steps that validated that, and it's an easy visual. So that's why we love the matrix document that the inspector can sit down with, and again, probably they're going to be most interested in your non-conforming results and the resolution for that. So keep that in mind, that that's probably where they want to concentrate. So make sure you have all your problem forms, etc. And then PQ, the last kind of validation, is for stressing your SOP, the actual SOP you will be using, making sure your people who are part of your SOP basically have been trained and are validated and are competent to do the work. That's what your goal is in your PQ activity, and how it should be documented is kind of the evidence that you have to keep is kind of logical, that you need SOPs and they should have been updated for the new system, and anywhere where, so in other words, if it says version of software in the SOP, make sure you updated that to the new version. Make sure anything that's different in the new version, the SOP has been modified to account for that, that people have been trained and they're competent, so keeping training records, competency records, training manuals, any other training materials you use that'll prove that you did train people. Part of this PQ is notifications to other departments that the new system's going live, because there's usually an impact on them. Either you've got downtime and you need to let them know about that, and they have to go into a backup process to get orders, etc. to you, or it could be that they're actually going to be part of this new process you're putting in place. And again, they should have been part of the discussion to begin with, but very least they need a notification before you go live, and that should be documented so that it's proof that you didn't forget about these other departments and not let them know you have something new happening. JACO likes things to be all documented. If you did a data conversion, you should have information about how that went, what your process was for testing the process that you were going to use for data conversion, and that it was validated. PQ validation results and any corrective actions. So, some summary of how your PQ went and what you did to correct any problems you had with it. And then a statement from your medical director that the system meets minimum requirements to go into production. That's been since '92 when that became standard, that the blood bank was a medical device. That was kind of standard, that the medical director has to say yay or nay. The system can go live. And so now, okay, so I took about the first half and to just do the background, but now I want to actually show you using documents you get from us or that you can create in your own place, that how you can defend your validation. And again, I say defend. I think it's more that I want you to feel like you have everything you need. So sort of an attitude of, okay, tell me what you want to see, I've got it, and be secure that you have everything. So let's just start at the beginning, because this being able to defend your validation starts long before they walk through the door. Okay, it starts with the planning that you went through. So all that planning of that, your life cycle, all the things that you put together, very important, and are going to be helpful when the assessor or the inspector walks in. Your SOPs updated to the version of software you're using and proof that your people are competent. You're going to need to accumulate all those. And again, having it in one place in that master validation plan is a really great idea, because with all of this and a summary, this becomes a plan, because you have to organize all this information and look organized and be confident that you have what you need and you've done the right thing. And you don't, the ideal situation is, as I said, we don't want to defend it as much as we just want to display it. And we want to say, we're proud of it. Here it is. So here's what you need. So this master validation plan, it's something that we put together many, many years ago. Many years ago now. We've updated it to be more relevant in certain areas. But this is where, if you look at the second page, the table of contents, all of these parts of this validation plan are all of the things. I mean, some of them are more than we discussed earlier in this presentation, but if you just look at the list, you know, having a background, you know, basically a plan of what this is all about. We're taking an upgrade to this version of software and blah, 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 the background of this whole project. Having a validation policy, documentation requirements, SOP, training overview, test plan development, how you develop test plans, and how you use those, what your review and approval and authorization process is, and so on through the list. So this plan has everything in it that you need to show, and with using this plan with what you get from a validation, and here's the next page that actually shows some information on the background and the review, approval, and authorization page. So using this plan and all the documents you got from IQCQ and testing and your change control policy and your risk mitigation plan, that's how you will be able to have everything in one place and be able to provide this. It's a full plan and then documents that show that you executed your plan and what came out of that, all in one place, and it starts with your SOPs. So having SOPs, and I can't stress this enough because I know I've been to several lives where I've said, where are the SOPs? And I've heard, we're going to update those later after we're live. That is just so not. I'm just from my experience, and I hope you'll take it as an experienced person talking to you. That's just not the way to get these critical functionality, these critical pieces of functionality to work the way you expect them to work if you don't have SOPs that document each step you expect your people to be able to do when they get into the system. And make sure you also, by the way, have an SOP that talks about your domains and how you'll have a test system or a training system or whatever or a build system, whatever you call it. It just can't be the production system. And this SOP should have in it how you will use these different areas or domains in the system to stay in control. Okay, so very important that you have an SOP for everything. And if you have a master plan and it says that you'll have SOPs and here's how they'll be written and here's where they're kept, then the inspector or the assessor will know when they're sitting there with you, wow, this site really has it all together. They have SOPs and they have the proof that they did train their people. and that they did make sure everyone's confident before they use the system. So, you know, I guess I can't stress SOP enough, that, you know, in order to get a good SOP, you have to review those release notes that come, or the new manual if it's a new system. You need to make sure you know when you need to validate, and again, we talked a little bit about that before, that not every change means you have to validate it, but every change means you have to have assessed it, thought about it, not just you, multiple people who this change will affect. Think about it and say, okay, what's the risk if this doesn't work? If there's no risk, then you may not need to include it in validation, but you sure do need to document in the release notes that you didn't need to validate it, and say why you didn't need to validate it. And if you do need to validate it, you'll need to say how you will validate it. And even if you use someone to do validation for OQ, remember you still have that PQ step, which is proving your people can use the new system following validated SOPs, and they're confident to do the work. So even small changes, if it's got a user interface connection and there's some change to the user interface, that will need some sort of validation. It might not be OQ, but it might be training or a difference in the SOP. So you've got to assess your SOPs and make sure that you know the ones that are affected by whatever the upgrade is. And this is what you present to your inspector with your SOPs and your summary, your master validation plan with your summary document of how things went during the validation. This will save you time and it'll save them time, which they'll appreciate. It also will make you look like you're in control, and you had control and have control of your system and your upgrade process. And the good news is, what we found is, when you do all of this, you have fewer questions and they don't stick around as long. So, because they know what to expect, and after that it will be just spot checking, and they won't be looking at every single document you have and asking more questions. So now's the time to look at what we can help you with as far as defending or proving or displaying your validation. And it begins with the validation review instructions. So yes, we actually give you instructions that come with your validation documentation at the end of the project of how to use this documentation we're providing to show and display your validation proudly to your assessor and inspectors. And it's got a little bit of a blurb in the front about how to use this documentation, but actually page 2, there's an 11-step process, and that's what we're going to go through now. It's an 11-step process that, using the documentation you already have, how you have what you need to prove that you are in control of your system. Okay, so the first thing it says in this, and it might be a little small and hard to read, but it says, review your summary document and your conclusion document that you got from BC Solutions, from us, on the CD that we sent, or if you got a download from the network, it should all be formatted that you can find your summary document with the conclusions in it, so that you have an overview of what's in the documentation. You have a good grasp of what all you have, and you could tell an inspector how that documentation is put together on these CDs. Okay, so again, the first thing you want to do is go to your summary, and this is actually a page. I changed the name to Protect the Innocent here, and made it just Ideal Blood Bank. Isn't that what we're all going for, is an Ideal Blood Bank? So that's the name of my blood bank. But this is an actual summary written for a site, and it's very similar to every time we do this. We write this summary document, and this is what I'm referring to in item 1 when it says get your validation summary document and become familiar with it, and know where everything is on the CD, and review all that documentation. And that all of this summary document is a write-up of everything that happened, and it's the conclusions of what happened as well. And so step 2 says, and I'm sorry it's not in front of you right now, but I'll read it to you. It says, review all your problem forms which discuss any issues or discrepancies discovered during the validation. So the problem forms are found in the problem form folder, which will be a folder that you just open up for the problem forms, and you have to review all of these because we're identifying where we found the problem. We're telling you what it is. We're actually doing a risk assessment for you, but it's not in lieu of you because we need you. It's your system, so you need to really have reviewed these and make sure you agree with our assessment. But it gives you a good idea of whether you've got something to really worry about or not. We also will give you a recommendation for a workaround, which again would be the lowest level of mitigating the risk, if it's a risk, because you have to do it with an SOP. But anyway, it gives you a place to document what the workaround procedure is. There's an evaluation by the vendor because you're going to notify the vendor if it's something that the vendor needs to fix. So it would be if you said no, then you would, you can't do a workaround, then you have to get your vendor to evaluate it, tell you what the corrective action is, and then when you get the corrective action, right on this form you can document that it was delivered and then how you validated it after that, and it's signed off on. So your problem form has a lot of information that will help you to know where your problems are in the system and how you're going to mitigate them and keep track of you know, how you did and the fact that you retested it and what the plan was that you used to retest it. So this is, again, a copy of a real problem form that the kind that we send out when we finish a validation. Then step 3 says review the testing scripts with accompanying screenshots. So here are your screenshots. So in this plan, we have we're looking at screenshots that are ELC. When we go to the test plan, you'll see ELC plans. So this is the electronic cross-match plan, and it's been all of the evidence is under the code ELC with a sequential number. So, and to find out the number, and again, using your testing scripts to make sure you understand what's in the document, what we, again, referencing back to your summary, okay, what did they find? Did they find a problem? They said they found a problem here, step so-and-so. So you can look at what was set up and the steps, the actual steps, and if there was a problem, it would be documented in here. But notice this is where the system response has the code ELC, and in this folder with the ELC 000 to ELC 0070 are your screenshots. You want to become familiar between what your script said, what your screenshot shows, and how it shows that it proved what you were doing and that we did get the expected response. Okay, the next step says to go to your user requirements traceability matrix to see the requirements that were actually validated. So here's where you can, again, you want to make sure that you understand these plans in the last column, in this last column here. These plans are where the plan and the steps that actually validated these requirements. So you want to make sure you're familiar with the plans and can go back and forth between the plan and the evidence, which are JPEG files, and the summary document, which should have been written. We talked about that already. In the summary document, you should have not only what you plan to do, but then what happened when you followed your plan. Okay, you want to make sure you add to this plan and as documentation some things that aren't in the validation. So any internal validation that you did or staff training, documented in the plan. Implementation of any procedural changes, you want to show those clearly changed for this process because things needed to be changed. The process didn't work the way it was. Make sure you document your authorization, and here's a sample of the kind of sign-offs you have to do, but this is kind of the authorization statement that the system is okay to go live. There were no, basically the end has to be that there were no findings or conclusions drawn in the process that would suggest implementation of the process. That would suggest that you stop the implementation of the system. That's where you want it, what you want it to be. It isn't always that, but that's what you want it to be. Anything you do post-production to that you're documenting any issues, you should make sure you have documentation of those and you keep them. Everything is stored in a place that you can get to these easily, not like 10 levels down on a network drive somewhere. I mean, it's great. It's great to put it somewhere where it won't get harmed, all this documentation, but make sure it's readily available so when the inspector is sitting there and you start pulling this stuff up, they don't feel that it's just too difficult for you to find and that that will make them lose confidence that you're in control. So have it close to you, somewhere that you know it is. But we've just gone through how to defend to the FDA that if you have all this validation and all of this quality activity during your life cycle, you're in control. And so basically, in summary, have a plan, have it be organized, follow your plan. That's the biggest mistake people make, I must say, in 30 years of being in this business. The most trouble I've seen is when people don't follow their own plan. So make sure your plan works for you, not somebody else. It has to work for you, and you have to follow it, because when they're looking for are you in control, the easiest thing to see is if you said something in your plan and you didn't do it. It's so easy to find. It's ridiculous. So, if you say something, do it. Be organized and show off your hard work to our regulatory friends, and think of them as friends and not foes. And forget the defend. Okay, I'm done with the defend. Now I can see you have everything you need to be proud. So that's what I say, is be willing to show it proudly and show it as you're in control. And the FDA and the AABB will catch that. They will pick up on that, and it'll go a lot easier. And so that ends our presentation. I know we're a few minutes early, so I just want to say again, here on this slide is my email address. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me with questions, and what we'll do is we'll formulate the answer and we'll publish the whole list so you all can see what the questions were and what the answers were. And again, I am so appreciative that you all joined us today. We had more than 75 people on the line. I'm so proud to be talking to you in front of all of you. I'd like to invite you to our next teleconference, which will be in the third quarter of the year. I have no idea what the title is, but if you have an idea for a title, feel free to email me with title ideas, because I want to give you what you need, not what I need. But I've really enjoyed speaking to you today. I hope you've enjoyed the presentation, because I know that when you enjoy it, you learn better. So I hope you've enjoyed it. But at the minimum, I hope you got information on how you can take what you already have and be the best proof of you in control. Thank you very much for joining today. I'm going to sign off now, and I'll see you in 3 months. Bye-bye.